The big story that we are tracking today is, the latest that's coming in as far as Canada is concerned. It has now come out with fresh measures to what it says is going to curb migration. It is also likely to have an adverse effect on tens of thousands of foreign students, including those from India. So what has really happened, viewers, is that Canada has now decided to tweak its visa norms, giving extraordinary powers to its policemen and to its law enforcement agencies to see if at all someone's visa needs to be revoked. There are specific conditions that have been outlined, but it adds to huge amount of uncertainty for those who are already there. It negatively impacts those who apply for work as well as resident permits. Canadian border officials now have sweeping powers, and it is their discretion that can actually decide whether work permits are temporarily or permanently cancelled, rejected, or are asked to in fact go back right away. So this adds yet another layer of uncertainty. Comes from a Prime Minister who's just weeks away from demitting office. He's already said that he's no longer going to be in the race. So why are such measures coming in just when he's about to step out of office is another concern and a question that we'll put forth. But first, let's tell our viewers how this impacts India. There are 4.2 lakh Indian students that are enrolled in Canadian institutions. These changes will impact several of them. There are aspiring students as well as workers who may face unexpected hurdles. There could also be delays. Processing time may take longer. And what happens if midway during your course, your visa is actually rejected? That adds to a whole new level of uncertainty that we're going to put forth, that we're going to try and address in this conversation. But first up, let's quickly put out those big questions that I want to now address in this conversation with the experts joining me shortly. First and foremost, this is Trudeau government's final blow to Indian immigrants. Why is this coming? Next, what's really driving Canada's new visa norms? What's the trigger for something that is so arbitrary, something that leaves everything to the discretion of law enforcement officers? And which brings me to ask the next question, which is that should border officials actually be allowed to have such sweeping powers? It's one thing to enforce, it's quite another to rely only on the discretion of border officials. And then how can Indian immigrants actually protect themselves from this kind of uncertainty? Because as I said, we're talking about lakhs of people here. Professor Swaran Singh joins me on the broadcast, and I also have an immigration expert, Nona. Professor Singh, let me start by you. This comes at a time when there is enough and more uncertainty when it comes to immigration. But it also comes at a time when Justin Trudeau is set to demit office. What could possibly be his trigger to come out with something that's frankly very arbitrary in nature?
Thank you, Gaurie, for having me on your program. I think you rightly put it, the word uncertainty. The uncertainty, or I would say tensions in India-Canada relations for about last 2 years. And now the uncertainty unleashed by coming of President Donald Trump makes it particularly complicated and challenging, creating anxieties amongst all people who are Indian citizens or of Indian origin and now living in Canada in that sense. So this kind of current phase of starting new regulations, tightening up the process is triggered, of course, by the meeting between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump, and Donald Trump threatening to impose 25% tariffs on Canada in case Canada doesn't tighten up its immigration or the flow of fentanyl opiate into United States. And that is the immediate trigger, but there is an ongoing process where Canada has completely mismanaged its immigration, which it first opened the doors, but it was not able to handle the flow of immigrants, leading to all kinds of internal crises, which triggered political crisis for Justin Trudeau as well. So, for example, last year only about 50,000 students could not join colleges on time simply because they were not given visas on time. And of these, about 20,000 were Indian students, forming about 5.4% of total student the community of Indians. A year before that, I was myself in University of British Columbia, and we used to hear about these stories from parents saying that their kids are not able to reach Canada in time because of various difficulties in visa process. So it's an ongoing thing which is getting further complicated now because of the added push from Trump administration, in which case, of course, India also stands to suffer partly because, as you know, over last 2 years, there have been also firing of several diplomats on both sides. So one standard explanation
No,
for
but
India
Professor
always,
Singh, this is not only for Indian students, right? So
yes,
you're talking about the relationship as if it is about only Indian students. No,
no, no,
it's about everybody. But yeah,
it's
my
about
question to
everybody.
you was that why something so arbitrary in nature can actually be imposed and enforced?
I think that also again explains how in last 2 years we have seen Justin Trudeau taking decisions which stand to no logic absolutely, and that's how you remember his deputy prime minister had resigned, saying that he is initiating things that has them that make no sense for them. It's basically perhaps populism or sort of propitiating certain maybe communities or constituencies at home, but fundamentally also underlining the mismanagement of whole immigration process. And I agree that it's for all the people coming into Canada, but because Indian community almost forms 5% of foreign nationals, immigrants into Canada, India stands to also be very concerned about
Okay,
what is happening in Canada.
okay, Miss Bains, if you were to advise students right now looking at Canada as a possible destination, what would your advice to them be?
See, right now, when we are looking at Canada, it is getting very difficult for the students to apply for the postgraduate work programs. And even many of them who have, who are graduating now, they might not even get the work, the work permits and all. Then they'll have to come back to the country. So as of now, Canada will not be a country that we would be advising our students to go into till the time there is more clarity on the policies of the post work permit programs. Because with the kind of power they have given to the Canadian border officials, most of the temporary resident visas, whether it is students or whether it is ETAs or it is TRVs, anything can be rejected or put on hold or altered. So this kind of a volatile environment, it is very difficult for the students to now get into Canada. And if they are in Canada and any time of point their visa is rejected, then there is no clarity on the education fees they have paid to the universities, the loans they have taken, the rentals, the deposits. There's no clarity to the parents and the students. So it is
Okay.
very volatile for them to go to Canada at this point.
Okay, so it's volatile to go, but then that doesn't mean you don't go if you want to study there, right? It just means that you have to be more prepared.
Yeah, and you have
Professors,
to select the universities accordingly. So the universities which have a better standing, because there are different levels of universities that there in Canada. So they have become more stringent with the universities with the mediocre standing. But the top universities, yes, definitely they have more
okay,
liberal programs,
okay. There were
and they have also
20,000 more
instituted
people who went to Canada this year as compared to last year. So there is a
yeah.
growing number of over 4.2 lakh students who study there in Canada. So we're talking about a
Yeah.
very large number of people. Professor Singh, I
Yeah.
want to ask you this, that as someone who's been there, who's also someone who interacts with students so regularly, what would you say to all those youngsters who will be very uncertain right now because of the fact that it could be the local officer whose discretion may come in handy? And believe, and whether we like to say it or not, racism is a reality. What happens if you come across a racist law enforcement officer whose discretion and whose colored view could decide whether you stay on to complete your course or not in Canada?
I think fundamental problem here is that in any democratic country, you cannot suddenly unleash regulations where you authorize border officials to deny entry, deny visa of all categories, with absolutely no opportunity for a legal recourse. What kind of democratic country we would look at where you do not have recourse to legal relief to anyone who's been suddenly denied his papers? But problem also in our case is, I agree with the fact that some of the celebrated institutions would stand slightly at a better position and will not be vulnerable to those, as you mentioned, racism and biases of people on border, among border officials. But it's also true that I think we need also to be looking at lots of these virtually unregulated agents who are around the world sending people to the first world or developed countries with enormous investment from their families, and therefore I think
Indeed.
that also creates temptation to break rules and then try to make sure they are able to get back some financial gains at end of
Okay, I am going to then
their
ask you
education.
another question before I get in Nona very quickly, which is that What about the local sentiment right now? Canada is also going through its period of churn. The Conservative Party is gaining momentum. It is coming, or it is going to fight election on an anti-immigrant plank. Do you think it is Trudeau's last-ditch effort to try and, possibly gain some momentum with the local sentiment?
I think it's both placating to local sentiments, but much more placating to President Donald Trump, who's threatening 25% tariffs in case immigration is not regulated, and is blaming Canada for not controlling that kind of flow of drugs and so on. But it's also important to see that, by now Justin Trudeau should understand that at least for short-term future, his political career is finished. I mean, I don't think he's being endorsed by any number of people. He's on party, he's on people, his media, everybody is distancing or against him. And we will definitely see some change after elections, but the whole mood, fundamental problem for a common Canadian, whether he's an immigrant or citizen today, is that cost of living has gone up, and the anxiety has gone up because of these whole media coverage of regulations of this nature. And that anxiety and cost of living going up makes them really much more sort of look at blaming on people who are coming from outside.
Now, you made a very valid point, sir, about the fact that this is some way of trying to placate Trump, given the fact that the Trump administration has been saying that Canada needs to work on its open border with the US, the northern border as it is called. Nona, now respond to the fact that there is now a sentiment that is both in Canada as well as in the US and several other parts as well. So what will be your advice to all those students, their parents, who would be wondering which are the avenues that are actually open now? And are there any other countries that you're going to advise them apart from Canada?
Yes, so what we do is we advise students for Australia, New Zealand, and then European. There are a lot of universities in Europe which are coming up, and they have become very popular with the students, especially with this crisis of US and Canada coming up. And earlier, what was the thing is that Canada was giving you a permanent residency. It was giving you a work permit of up to 3 years after your PG diploma or PG programs. But now with the scenario that is there, they're not even sure whether they'll be able to finish their education and what will happen to the fees that they have paid in the universities. Australia and Europe, New Zealand have become very favorite of many of our clients here.
Right, let's leave it there. Thanks much, both of you. Appreciate you taking out the time to join me on India Global.